Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is another YouTube video to help you improve your chess game. We haven't done a 20-minute exercise in a few months, so let's do one of those. If you're new to the 20-minute exercise, it's an exercise which you can do, which I'm going to do for you, but you can do to practice. A lot of people don't have time to play, slow games. They only can jump in here or there and play fast games on the internet, and they want to learn how to think better, but they don't have the time to really do that, to compare moves and see how much they can see and visualize. So they never develop those skills. But you could, if you only have 20 minutes, you could do what's called a 20-minute exercise, where you take a random position and you see how much you could see in 20 minutes. So I've done a few of those for my YouTube channel, but let's do another one. I'm going to take a random game from the candidates tournament. Today is 422. So I think I'll take game 4 out of the library, and we'll do White's 22nd move. Now, if it's a recapture and there's nothing to analyze, then we'll just go to the next move. But I have no idea what it's going to be. So let's do that right now. We'll pull up the candidates tournament here. Window, events, candidates tournament, libless candidates 20, even though it's 21 now. All right, libless candidates 20. Examine candidates 20 number 4. So let's do that. Examine candidates 20 number 4. Okay, Nepo against Grischuk. All right, we're going to get White's 22nd move. Let's go quickly through the game to get to the 22nd move. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop B5, Roy Lopez, Berlin wall, main line. Pawn takes, knight F3, queen takes, king takes, knight C3. They're probably going to play book here for a ton of moves. H3, H5, bishop F4. Notice Nepo started with 100 minutes. 100 minutes on his clock. He's up to 104 because it's 30-second increment and it's all book. You'll know whether they're out of book when all of a sudden his clock goes down. Grischuk's been using a little bit of time. Nepo still playing quickly. We're going for White's 22nd move. Rook Fe1. So far, again, Nepo hasn't used any time. A3, played immediately. Everything's been played immediately for White. Pawn takes. H4, King H2, still immediate. King F8. There we go. Rook B1. The first non-book move of the game comes on move 18 for White. Black's been out of his book for a few moves. All right, we're going to go to move 22. Rook B1 threatens the B7 pawn. B6 to save the pawn. Rook to B4. Rook lift. Rook to E8. Rook A4 hitting the A pawn. A5 saving the pawn. Bishop back to D2. Maybe getting ready to play F4. Black plays C5. Okay, here we are. We're going to take 20 minutes. We got 3 minutes on the clock, so we're going to go up to about 23 minutes. Okay, so what do we find out? Well, let's count the material. Black has 7 pawns, a bishop, knight, and 2 rooks. White has 7 pawns, a bishop, knight, and 2 rooks. White has a little bit more activity for his pieces. White's pawn structure is worse. He's got isolated A pawn, doubled isolated C pawns, but the doubled isolated C pawns are not on a semi-open file, so they're not that vulnerable. And not only that, they're playing defense. So when you have wrecked pawns on defense, in other words, Black has a 4-on-3 queenside majority. When you have the wrecked pawns on defense, they're a lot better than when they're on offense. And White's offense is the 4-on-3 majority on the king side, and that is completely intact. So White's pawn structure, even though it looks worse, theoretically, with his nice 4-on-3, Black has more of a crippled 4-on-3 with his doubled C pawns. So White actually has the easier time trying to create a passed pawn here. All right, let's look at the last couple moves by the two players. White plays bishop to D2. That frees the F4 square for the rook and for the pawn. Black plays C5. He was already guarding the B5 square. That guards the D4 square, but I don't think White was going to put anything on D4. The knight on F5 blocks that. Okay, so we have to figure out what white's trying to do, what black's trying to do. Eventually, what white wants to do is create a passed pawn on the king's side. If he could trade off into a king and pawn endgame, that would be nice. White has a discovered attack on the rook on h6, but that's relatively inconsequential. If white plays knight takes e6, then rook on h takes e6, saving the rook. If white plays knight takes f7, then black just smiles and takes the knight on f7, and then when white plays bishop takes h6, black wins 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, 2 pieces, even though the Reinfeld values for the 2 pieces against a rook and a pawn is 6 against 6. The Reinfeld value undervalues the value of the pieces in that case. So you would almost rarely, if never, give up a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn if you're in an equal position. So knight takes f7, not a candidate move. All right, so now white's rook on a4 has really nothing to do on a4. He's not attacking the pawn on a5. He has no break moves on a5, so that rook has to come back in the game. It can't come back via b4. Right now c4 is guarded by the bishop. He could play knight takes e6 and then rook c4, but what's the point? That doesn't make any sense. The rook on c4 wouldn't be doing anything either. So that rook can come back to e4. It can come to f4. If he goes to g4, black has a discovery with a knight. Not sure that's worth anything, but there's no real reason to go to g4 anyway. So moving the rook on a4 to e4 or f4 is a candidate move. Once we play f4 instead of rook f4, if we put the pawn on f4, if black plays a move like bishop to d5, then white can't get the rook easily back in the game. The rook on a4 would be blocked from b4, c4, d4, e4, and f4. And of course can't get to g4 because the pawn's on f4. So I think pawn to f4, black can probably play bishop d5. Can white play e6 against that? Black has a lot of pieces on the e6 square. It doesn't look like it. So I kind of don't like f4 bishop d5 unless I can find some reason to do that. Now let's say I move my rook to e4 or f4. If I move my rook to e4, black can still play bishop d4, bishop d5. So we're looking at rook to e4, rook on 4 to e4, and then black playing bishop to d5. And where would the rook go? Well, if the rook goes back to e2, black could keep attacking it forever with bishop c4, and then rook e4, and then bishop d5 with a draw. So rook on 4 to e4, bishop d5, rook e2, bishop c4, rook e4, bishop d5 is a draw for. Now white can always vary by playing rook f4. So let's look at playing rook f4 right away. Why are we looking at that? Well, it gets the rook back in the game, but also white has already just moved his bishop back to d2, which cleared that square. And that doesn't pin the knight. If the knight on f5 moves, the pawn on f7 is guarded by the bishop. But it creates a little bit of pressure, and if the knight moves, also the pawn on h4 has to be guarded by the rook. The drawback of rook f4 is it blocks the bishop's diagonal. Bishop no longer has discoveries against h6, but we already saw that wasn't a big deal. So rook f4, just to get the rook back in the game, is a candidate move. From there, the rook could go to f3 if he needs to. You know, we really don't want that rook on a4 to end up getting somewhat trapped. So rook f4 is safe. It's the opposite color of the bishop. The knight can't hit that square. We're not worried about rooks hitting rooks. We're not worried about him hitting it with the pawn on g5. If he tried to play f6 and then g5, that doesn't look like it would work at all. White could just remove the guard on the knight. In fact, after rook f4, if then white plays knight takes e6, black can't take with a rook because rook takes f5, so he'd have to take with the pawn, pinning the knight to the king, and then maybe white could play, I don't know, well, rook takes f5 check, e takes f5, bishop takes h6, doesn't seem to do it. Here, what am I looking at? I'm looking at, let's just show you. Rook f4. If he does nothing, let's say, excuse me, let's say he plays rook to g6. Well, let's not say he plays rook g6. Rook f4 let's say he plays rook to b8. Then knight takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes f5, e takes f5, bishop takes h6, g takes h6. We sack the exchange to win the exchange. That doesn't really do much. But we do have a little bit of pressure there. So rook f4 is definitely a candidate move. Now, is the rook in any danger right now? Can the bishop go back to d7? I don't think so. So white could play other moves. He could, as we said, he could play f4 and then play the rook to e4. But after f4, bishop d5, I'm not all that convinced. He can't play a move like c4 to hold up black from playing a later b5, because then the rook on a4 would be basically lost. So if you play c4, you could almost resign. Black could play a move like bishop d7, hit the rook, and the rook is trapped. So you don't want to trap your own rook. Weak players make moves like that, and they say, well, I played c4, so I could stop b5. And the answer is, well, yeah, but you got to look at all the things that move does, and one of the things it does is trap your own rook. So c4, not a candidate move. All right, so we're looking at rook f4. We're looking at rook on 4 to e4. We looked at f4. I didn't like it that much. Suppose we move the knight and attack the rook. Is there any reason to do that? Knight f3 hits the pawn on h4. But black can just move the rook to somewhere else on the h-file. Let's say rook to h5. And if white plays g4, black can play h takes g en passant. Then f takes g. And already that h3 pawn is starting to look a little weak. So I'm not sure knight f3 does that much. Not a bad move. What else can we do? Knight to e4, again, seems to trap my own rook on a4. If I play knight e4, he could play bishop d7. If I then play rook c4, he plays bishop to b5, hitting a4 and c4. And my rook is trapped yet again. All right, so we're seeing it's very easy for white to put things on the 4th rank and trap that rook on a4. So knight f3 is a candidate, but I'm not sure it does that much. Can white play g4 right away? g4, h takes g3, f takes g3, and now the knight moves on f5 and hits h3, but the knight on g5 is guarding h3. G4 doesn't seem very right. Black would be very happy to play h takes g and open up that h-file. And we're not forcing the knight to move by g4, and even if we were forcing the knight to move, is that a big deal? Well, I guess it is. The knight is a little bit trapped on f5. So, okay, let's look at that a little more. g4, trapping the knight. He has to take en passant. White takes back. And now, the knight always has e7. So the knight can even go to e7 right away. And rook takes h3 is not a threat because the knight is on it. Is he threatening to remove the guard with f6? Probably not, because then just knight takes e6 removes the other guard, or the other attacker on h3. Let's take the lines off the board. Go back. Okay. So, it's funny. I do this, and one of the whole ideas of doing a 20-minute exercise is so you can visualize and practice visualization so you can move the pieces around in your head. And then people say to me, Dan, why don't you move the pieces so I can follow you better? And I'm like, but that's the whole idea of the exercise, is to work on things like your visualization. So if I move the pieces around, then you're not working on the exercise. So we're destroying one of the purposes of the exercise. Okay, I've just noticed that my screen is not quite centered. So the 8th rank is not well shown here. All right, so let's recenter the board. Okay, so I apologize for not doing that at the start. I knew the board wasn't centered, and then I forgot about it. All right, so we've been missing the 8th rank here for black, and I apologize for that. But not much was happening on the 8th rank. There was always a king on f8 and a rook on e8 like there is here, and we weren't really moving them very much. So I apologize that the 8th rank for black was covered up. You know, let's complete the exercise. It's still a good exercise. 98% of what I did really didn't even matter that you couldn't see the 8th rank. But again, I apologize for that. All right, so we've now fixed the board, and a little embarrassing. All right, so back to our 20-minute exercise. We have another 8 minutes to go. So far, my top candidate move is rook to f4. I'm not all that super happy with it. I think after rook f4, maybe white is slightly better. Maybe it's dead equal. I'm just trying to see what white was trying to do because, you know, I guess on rook f4, is he threatening knight takes f7? Knight takes f7, he can't take with the bishop because the rook takes f5. But he can take with the king, and we still can't play g4, and we can't get another piece attacking f5. Bishop on d2 can never attack f5. The knight would need 3 moves to attack f5, or 3 moves to get to f5. So, not sure on that. What else could white do besides something like rook f4? Okay, so white will play... we already said knight e4 is bad. We said rook on 4 to e4 is bad. I'm trying to open my mind to other possibilities. c4 traps the rook on bishop d7. g4 is a move. It's not terrible, but you know, so far I don't see a lot of moves for white. Playing rook on e1 to some other file doesn't make sense. That just abandons the e pawn. So if we did that, black would have discoveries with moves like bishop d7. I mean, f4 allows that, but then we have to move our. We said we have to move our rook to e4, and he could stop that with bishop d5. I'm just looking for other ideas. He has obviously white has no queenside pawn break moves, so the only queenside pawn move c4 is terrible. You know, it doesn't look like Nepo has a lot of candidate moves here. Knight f3 is a candidate. I guess g4 or g3 are candidates. Rook f4, rook on 4 to e4 are candidates. I don't think he can move the king. If he moves the king away, then he can never play g3 because black has a pawn and a knight guarding g3. So the king is on its optimum square right now. So moving the king's not a move. How about moving the f-pawn up 1 square? Well, moving the pawn to f3 doesn't take any squares away from his pieces. Takes the f3 square away from my knight, and it weakens the g3 square for nothing. So f3 is not a candidate move. So it's turning out this 20-minute exercise might be a little easier than at first thought because white actually doesn't have that many moves. Rook f4, rook on 4 to e4. f4, I guess, is a move, but I really don't like it. g4 is a move, but I don't like it. Knight e4 takes the squares away from my rook again. Don't think I can do that. Knight f3 is a move. I'm not sure the idea. I guess we should talk about knight takes e6. All right, so let's look at knight takes e6. That's not the move you kind of normally play here. Why not? That's instructional. All right, so after knight takes the bishop, the rook on h6 is attacked by the bishop on d2 with a discovered attack, so black would almost undoubtedly play rook on h takes e6. But the problem there is the knight on f5 has now gotten very strong because white's only other piece that can attack it is, well, he could attack it with g4, but black always says en passant. And his knight on g5 can't be traded for it, and the bishop on d2 can't attack f5. So he could play rook f4 then, but black can just play g6. Or in fact, in that position, black would play rook on 6 takes e5, guarding the knight. So that's the problem. Knight takes e6, rook on 6 takes e6. Then black's threatening rook takes e5, so white would have to play something like f4. And now, if white ever plays g4, then h takes g4, and there's no g-pawn to ever get that knight off of f5. And what you have after knight takes e6, rook on 6 takes e6, is the traditional good knight against bad bishop endgame, especially if white has to play f4 to guard the e5 pawn and block in the bishop on d2. You know, some people read the first 3 editions of Jeremy Silman's How to Reassess Your Chess, and the 4th edition really is a complete rewrite, and it's a much better book, I think, where it really talks about all types of imbalances. But the first 3 editions of How to Reassess Your Chess, the main imbalance he liked to talk about was bishop versus knights. And after knight takes e6, rook on 6 takes e6, black would have a good knight against bad bishop kind of endgame. Now the good news for white is after a move like f4, he can now get his rook to the central files because that bishop on e6, which bothers him so much when he has that rook on a4 attacked by the late squares of the bishop on e6, he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. The problem is white's endgame, even though he has that 4-3 majority, would be blocked by the knight, and it would be very, very difficult to get anything going there, and black would probably have the better endgame after knight takes e6. So knight takes e6 is a candidate move, but after rook on 6 takes e6, I like that endgame for black better. I think black's got pressure on the e file. His knight on f5 is very strong. His pawn on h4 is held by the knight. If white ever pushes the g pawn, black can take en passant. If white pushes the f pawn, then when the g pawn pushes, he won't be able to take back with the pawn on f2 if the pawn's up on f4, which means after knight takes e6, rook on 6 takes e6, f4, white can never play g4 because of h takes g check. And that's just kind of disastrous. So white would get tortured in that endgame. So knight takes e6, not a big candidate move. Well, what else can we play? I like, we're running out of time, so I like rook f4 here. I think that's the best move. I don't think it does anything wonderful, but it solves some of white's problems. I'm not sure what his number 2 candidate move is. It could be rook on 4 to e4. I guess that's a move. And then later on, if he has to, he can go to f4. Knight f3 is a candidate. f4 I really don't like. We've already discussed various reasons. f4 without knight takes e6 is a little better than f4 after knight takes e6. But still, as we said, f4, maybe even bishop d5. And that rook on a4 has no squares. So black's not really threatening to win it right away, because if he plays bishop c6, that gives him the c4 square. And if he plays b5, that gives him the a5 square. So I don't think f4 loses the rook, at least not in the next few moves after bishop d5, but it doesn't look right. In fact, after f4, can black play knight g3 and then guard the e4 square and try to win the rook that way with bishop d7, bishop b5? He might. That rook is really running out of lines, so I don't trust any of those lines, those f4 lines. I don't want to put my pawn on f4. So I'm going to settle for rook to f4. Let's see what Nepo played. Yay! Rook f4. Okay. Boy, I'd feel bad if he didn't do that after all that. All right, f4. Let's ask Stockfish. What's the top 3 moves? All right, Stockfish. Let's bring you in. Got to make the window a little smaller so I can see it. All right, Mr. Engine here. All right, let's get back to where we were. Fix the size. Turn on the engine. Top 3 moves. All right. So Stockfish thinks that black's a little better. I'm not surprised. Maybe equal. He's looking at moving the g-pawn up to g4 or g3. And then, of course, taking en passant and then taking back with the f-pawn. And he thinks rook a to e4 is better than rook to f4. Let's see if rook f4 makes the 4th best move. Yep, not surprising. And look at the difference in the evaluation. The best move is 0, 0, 0. The 4th best move is around -0.2. So rook f4, which I liked and which Nepo liked, is about 2/10 of a pawn less than the engine's best move. Now rook f4 is moved up to the third best move. But it does seem like that. Now it's making a little more progress over rook a e4. It's only minus 0.05, 5/100ths of a pawn less than the optimum for best move. Okay, and now it just dropped down again. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I apologize for missing that 8th rank for the first half of the video. Please tell your friends about my channel, and you can like the video or subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.